When shooting with a wide angle lens, it's pretty easy to get sharp photos, but when we put a telephoto lens on our camera, things can become a little more tricky. So in today's video, I'll be talking about 5 ways to get sharper photos with your telephoto lens. I don't think I've ever attempted a video in such torrential rain before, but sometimes you get the best images when the weather is against you, don't you? And that's what I'm hoping for today. And on the way, we're going to be talking about some considerations that I run through when using my telephoto lens to get sharp photos. So let's get on up the trail, see if we can make an image this afternoon. Whew. It's going to be a wet one. So firstly, I want to talk about handheld shooting whilst using a telephoto lens. So to avoid camera shake, we'll need to make sure that we have a quick enough shutter speed. Now, the more zoomed in we are, the higher that shutter speed will need to be able to freeze any of our natural body movements that we might have. So the rule of thumb I like to follow here is that I like to try and keep my shutter speed equal to or over the focal length that I'm shooting at. So if I'm shooting at say 250mm, I'll need at least 1/250th of a second or faster to be able to avoid camera shake in the photos. Now do bear in mind though that if you're shooting on an APS-C or Micro Four Thirds camera, you need to take into consideration the crop factor. So my Fuji camera has a crop factor of 1.5 times, meaning I'll need to multiply 250mm by 1.5, which is 375mm, meaning I'm going to need 1/375th of a second or faster to be able to freeze any camera shake in the shot. Now don't be afraid to raise the ISO if you need to get a faster shutter. It's better to have a little noise than a blurry shot. Noise can easily be cleaned up in post-production, whereas blurry shot really can't. Wow, this weather. While I'm cleaning my lens, here's a few telephoto shots that I've shot in the past. A lot of new cameras have ibis or in-body image stabilization, and this means the sensor moves to reduce camera shake when we're hand holding. This means we can hand hold at lower shutter speeds than the rule of thumb that we previously mentioned. So my camera is up to 7 stops of ibis, but the one thing to note here are the words up to. If you dive into your camera's specs, you'll probably find that this maximum amount of stabilization was measured on a specific lens at a specific focal length. With my camera, it was recorded by the manufacturer on a 35mm prime lens. So they're saying you can get 7 stops of ibis with a 35mm lens. And if we follow that rule of thumb that we added earlier and the crop factor, we get 52mm. So they're saying you'll get up to 7 stops of ibis with a 35mm lens. And if we follow that rule of thumb and add the crop factor of 1.5, that means we get 52mm. So say we would need to shoot at 1/60th of a second without ibis. 7 stops or less is 2 seconds. Now I think that is achievable, but for me 1 second is more realistic, but I guess this is going to vary from person to person. What I've found though is the more we zoom in, the less effective ibis becomes in terms of stops of light that can be reduced before we introduce camera shake into the shot. Sure, it definitely reduces shake, but at 300mm shake becomes a lot more noticeable. For me personally, I found that about 4 stops of ibis is probably more accurate when I'm at the long end of my telephoto lens. Now this will be different depending on your equipment, the conditions, your ability to shoot handheld, and your current heart rate. You know, if you've just hiked up a massive hill, you're going to be more shaky than if you're resting, so that's also something else to consider. Also, a lot of lenses have optical image stabilization, so if your camera doesn't have ibis and you enjoy shooting handheld, it's worth looking at a lens that has OIS. This is ridiculous, but I think there might be a photo here, which I'm going to get set up right now. So we've got an absolute wonderful scene here. It looks fantastic. I'm trying to shield the lens from these heavy raindrops that are coming down. It's just ridiculous. Now, I did look at this scene in the winter when the trees were naked, but it just didn't really work. But now there's foliage, it blocks up a lot of the gaps in the trees, and this wonderful light coming through is so ethereal. It looks fantastic. So I'm not going to dwindle. I'm going to go ahead, shoot this image now at f9, 1/5 of a second, because we're so dark with these conditions. Keep the rain off the lens. Let's put my 2-second timer on. Oh, that looks great on the back of the camera. Really like that. Oh, sometimes when conditions are like this, you get your favourite images. Fingers crossed, that's what we've got here. Yeah, I really like this scene. So if you regularly watch the channel, you'll know that I like to use a tripod a fair bit to capture my images, and there's lots of reasons for this. Now, quite often I'm waiting for the light, and it makes sense to frame up the scene and be ready to capture things as required. I also enjoy the process of slowing down and fine-tuning my composition. However, the biggest reason is I often want to get the sharpest image I can. So for me, a sturdy tripod is essential for telephoto photography. Now, the more flex we've got in our tripod legs, the more shake will be introduced into the camera, especially when it's windy. Also, spikes are great for digging into soft ground, and they can really help to gain a more sturdy foundation. So I highly recommend buying the best tripod you can afford. Quite often, a good tripod will outlast many camera bodies, so it's definitely a really worthwhile investment. And it really helps to get sharp photos, especially with slow shutter speeds on the telephoto lens. I'm absolutely saturated, but I'm thoroughly enjoying it, as always. Now, I've shot this subject before, and I know it works with the telephoto lens, and every now and again we get this diffusion come across, this heavy fog. So at the minute it's quite clear. I'm just waiting for a bit more of that fog to roll in off the coast, which I'm sure it will do in a minute. So I'm going to get set up, get framed up, get the telephoto lens on. Swapping lenses is always pretty tricky, isn't it, when it's like this? And generally, I'll try and shield my camera body from the rain with my own body, and make sure I'm pointing everything down so nothing drips into the sensor. Right, let's get these lenses swapped over. Okay. It's a waiting game, isn't it? Always with landscape photography. Patience is key to getting the best photos. Let's just hope that fog does come back, because I'd love to get this shot here in summer. Here comes the rain again. Oof. So if you are shooting on a tripod, I found it's much easier to use a timer or shutter release cable like this, as it means you don't need to touch the camera when you take the image. Unless I need to take a shot at a specific time, say I'm shooting waves and I want to freeze some motion, for example, then I'll use my built-in timer, as it's just one less thing to have to set up. For most shots though, I'll use the 2-second timer, but I found when I'm using the telephoto lens, especially at the long end, sometimes that isn't enough time to let the camera settle. So I tend to use the 10-second timer when shooting on a telephoto. It's surprising how much longer it takes for a heavy telephoto lens to settle than a lighter wide-angle lens. So I'd highly recommend using a cable, shutter release, or a 10-second timer. Now, your biggest enemy when using a telephoto lens on a tripod is wind, and it can ruin your photos even when you think you might have a quick enough shutter speed. So if it's windy, I try to set up my tripod as low as I possibly can. Also try to position myself between the wind direction and the camera, as that will definitely help to reduce shake on the camera. I also flip my LCD flat against the body, as this can act like a sail when it's windy and definitely introduce vibrations. Now, I've heard a lot of advice in the past about hanging your camera bag on your tripod, but if it's really windy, it's possible that the bag will sway in the wind, and this can make things worse. So I definitely use that with great caution. If it's really windy, consider raising your ISO to get a quicker shutter speed instead, which will reduce camera shake. Another interesting topic is leaving IBIS on when your camera is on a tripod, and I've done a separate video all about that, which I'll leave down in the description. But I just want to mention this here. I now always leave my IBIS turned on whilst using a telephoto lens on a tripod, unless I'm taking very long exposures. In fact, the manufacturer of my camera recommends leaving IBIS turned on when this lens is on a tripod. But of course, you'll need to test this for yourself, and your kit may differ to mine. But if it's windy, I'll definitely consider leaving it switched on. So I'm not going to sugarcoat this afternoon. It's been pretty difficult in terms of filming this video and also the landscape photography. Really happy with that first image as it appeared on the back of the camera at least, but I was really hoping to get a shot looking back this way with the telephoto lens, as we were talking about telephoto landscape photography. But these conditions are not working in my favour now. This fog is not come back into the woodland as it was earlier. It's, you know, hanging around the perimeters, but it's just not penetrating this woodland. And I've waited about an hour now, and I am soaked to the skin, as is all of my equipment. So I'm pretty keen to get things back to the office and get things dried up. And I want to try and keep these videos as real as possible, and this is pretty much what landscape photography is like most of the time. Sometimes we get lucky, most of the time it's like this. But I've thoroughly enjoyed today's little outing, and I hope you've got some little nuggets there about shooting with a telephoto lens, even though we didn't get that much telephoto photography done today. Now, if you're interested in why I think telephoto lenses are so important, be sure to check out this video up here. I do hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, consider hitting the like button. And if you'd like to help the channel out further, then feel free to take a look at my zine. All of the proceeds will go to help create more videos like this. Until next week, take care, and I'll see you soon.